When a man begins to see through the illusions that govern most lives, he finds himself standing in a different world than those around him. Not elevated above them, not removed by choice, but separated by awareness. He sees the mechanisms that drive people, the invisible scripts they follow, the unexamined beliefs they defend as if their lives depend on it. And once seen, these patterns cannot be unseen. Most people move through life in a state of comfortable unconsciousness. They repeat what they've been told, chase what they've been taught to want, fear what they've been conditioned to fear. There's safety in that repetition, comfort in the familiar rhythms of acceptable thought and behavior. But for the man who has started to wake up, that comfort becomes impossible to maintain. He begins to notice the contradictions everywhere. People claiming they want freedom while building ever more elaborate cages. Individuals preaching authenticity while performing carefully rehearsed versions of themselves. Communities built on the promise of connection that demand conformity as the price of belonging. He sees it clearly now, the ways people trade awareness for acceptance, truth for tranquility, genuine presence for the illusion of peace. This clarity changes everything, though nothing about his external life may shift immediately. He still goes to the same places, sees the same faces, participates in the same routines, but internally, a fundamental transformation has occurred. He's no longer seeking the same things from these interactions. He's no longer operating from the same motivations, and that invisible shift creates a distance that others can sense even if they cannot name it. The conversations that once seemed meaningful now reveal themselves as elaborate dances of ego reinforcement. Two people taking turns validating each other's narratives, neither willing to challenge, neither truly listening, both simply waiting for their turn to be affirmed. He participated in this dance for years without recognizing it. Now he sees the steps so clearly, he can no longer pretend to follow along. When he stops playing his expected role, the people around him become uncertain. They feel something has changed but cannot identify what. He hasn't become hostile or withdrawn in any obvious way. He still responds when spoken to, still shows up when expected. But the energy is different. The familiar patterns of exchange no longer function smoothly. Where there was once easy agreement, there's now a quiet neutrality. Where there was once enthusiastic participation, there's now a calm observation. Some interpret this as arrogance, as if his refusal to engage in the usual performances stems from a belief that he's better than them. Others see it as depression, assuming his quietness must signal some inner darkness. A few recognize it for what it is, a fundamental shift in values, but even they often don't know how to relate to this new version of him. Because relating to him now would require them to question the very foundations upon which their own lives are built. And most people are not ready for that kind of examination. He understands their resistance without judgment. He remembers what it felt like to live within the comfortable boundaries of conventional thinking, to find security in shared beliefs, to derive meaning from external validation. He knows the terror that can arise when those foundations begin to crack. So he doesn't push, doesn't preach, doesn't attempt to wake anyone who isn't already stirring on their own. But neither does he pretend to sleep simply to make others comfortable. And that refusal to pretend, gentle as it may be, creates ripples in every relationship he maintains. The friendships that were based on shared complaints and mutual ego-stroking begin to feel hollow. The family dynamics that relied on him playing certain roles start to malfunction. The professional relationships built on unspoken agreements to never question certain premises become strained and awkward. He watches these connections fade without trying to force them back to life. Not because he doesn't care, but because he understands that these relationships were never truly about him as a complete human being. They were about the role he played, the needs he filled, the way he reflected back what others wanted to see. And now that he's no longer willing to confine himself to those narrow definitions, the relationships built on such foundations cannot survive. This is when the real solitude begins. Not the temporary loneliness of being away from people, but the profound solitude of being present among them while operating from an entirely different framework of reality. He can be in a room full of people and feel the vast distance between his inner world and theirs. He can engage in conversation while simultaneously observing the performance, seeing the fear beneath the bravado, the desperation beneath the confidence, the profound uncertainty beneath the proclaimed certainties. Most people mistake this solitude for sadness. They assume he must be suffering, must be missing out on something essential. But in truth, he's discovered something they haven't yet encountered. A kind of peace that doesn't depend on external circumstances. A stability that emerges not from being connected to others, but from being deeply connected to himself. A fullness that comes not from accumulating relationships and experiences, but from being completely present with what is. He no longer needs constant stimulation to feel alive. The addiction to novelty, to excitement, to drama that drives so much human behavior has loosened its grip on him. He can sit in silence for hours and feel no restlessness. He can be alone for days and feel no loneliness. Not because he's become cold or disconnected, but because he's found something within himself that he was always searching for in the external world. This doesn't mean he's become a hermit or rejected human connection entirely. He still values genuine interaction, still appreciates authentic exchange. But his definition of what constitutes real connection has radically shifted. He's no longer interested in relationships built on need, on mutual dependency, on the careful negotiation of egos. He's only interested in connections that allow both people to remain fully themselves, to speak honestly, to meet without pretense or performance. These kinds of connections are rare. They cannot be manufactured through effort or strategy. They emerge spontaneously when two people who have done their own inner work happen to cross paths. There's no need for explanation, no need for justification, no need for the usual social protocols. Just a simple recognition, a meeting of two beings who have stopped performing and started living. He's learned to wait for these moments without demanding them. He no longer approaches relationships with an agenda or expectation. He doesn't need people to understand him, doesn't need them to validate his perspective, doesn't need them to join him in his way of seeing. If connection happens naturally, he welcomes it. If it doesn't, he remains content in his own presence. This acceptance of solitude as a natural state rather than a problem to be solved marks a profound shift in his relationship with existence itself. He's no longer fighting against what is, no longer trying to force reality to conform to his preferences, no longer measuring his life against some imagined ideal of how things should be. He's simply here, present, aware, allowing life to unfold as it will. People often ask him if he's happy, as if happiness were some constant state to be achieved and maintained. He finds the question almost meaningless now. Happiness, as most people understand it, is a fleeting emotional state dependent on favorable external conditions. What he's discovered is something far more stable than that. A deep okayness with existence that persists regardless of circumstances. Joy can arise or not arise. Pain can come or not come. Success and failure, gain and loss, praise and criticism, all of it moves through without disturbing the fundamental ground of his being. This equanimity confuses people who are still caught in the endless pursuit of positive experiences and avoidance of negative ones. They interpret his calmness as indifference, his acceptance as resignation, his peace as apathy. They don't understand that he hasn't stopped caring about life. He simply stopped being tyrannized by his preferences about how life should unfold. He participates fully in what arises without clinging to what he wants or resisting what he doesn't. The more deeply he settles into this way of being, the more clearly he sees how much energy most people waste in constant resistance to reality, fighting against what is, arguing with circumstances, replaying the past, rehearsing the future. Anything to avoid being fully present with this moment exactly as it is. He did this for decades himself, exhausted himself in the endless effort to make reality conform to his ideas about how it should be. Now he sees the futility of that struggle and has laid it down. Without that constant internal warfare, he has access to resources of energy and attention he never knew existed. The mental space that was once consumed by worry and planning and regret is now available for simple presence. He notices things he never noticed before. The quality of light in the afternoon, the sound of rain on different surfaces. Life becomes richer not through the accumulation of experiences, but through the depth of attention he brings to each moment. This richness cannot be shared with those who are still living on the surface of things, still skating across the top of life in search of the next distraction. And so the gap between him and most people continues to widen, not because he's moving away from them, but because he's moving in a different direction entirely. They're moving horizontally, seeking more of this and less of that. He's moving vertically, going deeper into the present moment, into awareness itself, into the ground of being that underlies all experience. He knows this path cannot be explained to those who haven't begun to walk it themselves. Words fail to capture what can only be discovered through direct experience. So he doesn't try to convince anyone, doesn't attempt to sell his perspective, doesn't even particularly care if others understand what he's discovered. He's simply living according to what he's seen to be true, allowing the consequences of that choice to unfold naturally. Those consequences include a life that looks from the outside like it might be missing something. Fewer friends, less social activity, more time alone. A simplicity that could be mistaken for poverty of experience. But from the inside, it's the opposite. A richness beyond measure. A depth of engagement with existence that makes his previous way of living seem like sleepwalking. A freedom that comes not from having more options, but from being free of the compulsion to choose according to others' expectations. He walks through the world now as a stranger, not hostile, but fundamentally other. He speaks the same language, but means different things by the same words. He occupies the same spaces, but experiences them in an entirely different way. He's present, but not quite here in the way others are here. Not absent or dissociated, but operating from a different center, a different ground, a different understanding of what it means to be alive. This strangeness is not something he cultivated or chose. It's simply what happened when he stopped pretending to be what he wasn't, stopped trying to fit where he didn't fit, stopped sacrificing his awareness for the comfort of belonging. The cost of that choice is ongoing solitude. The gift is an authenticity that makes the solitude not just bearable, but rich with meaning. He no longer waits for the world to change, for people to wake up, for conditions to improve. He's realized that waiting for external change is just another form of resistance to what is. Instead, he's become the change he once hoped to see in others, not through grand gestures or public declarations, but through the quiet, consistent choice to remain awake in a world that constantly invites him back to sleep. And in that wakefulness, he's discovered something unexpected. The solitude that once seemed like a loss has become a gain. The distance from others that once felt like exile has become a homecoming to himself. The silence that once threatened to swallow him has revealed itself as the space in which real life happens. Not the noisy, busy, distracted pseudo-life that most people mistake for living, but the actual, direct, unmediated encounter with existence that is always available but rarely accessed. He walks alone through a world full of people because in some fundamental sense, he cannot do otherwise. The awakening that has happened cannot be reversed. The clarity that has emerged cannot be clouded again by convenient illusions. The freedom that has been tasted cannot be traded back for the security of unconsciousness. And so he continues, step by step, by moment, awake and alone, and more alive than he ever was when he was surrounded by others, but asleep to himself. This is not a tragedy. This is not a failure. This is simply what happens when a man stops living according to external programming and starts living from his own direct knowing. The path becomes narrow. The company thins out. The noise recedes, and in the space that opens up, something emerges. Something that was always there but obscured by the constant effort to be acceptable, to be approved of, to belong. His actual self. Not the performed version, not the adapted version, not the version that plays well with others, but the raw, unpolished, authentic presence that he is beneath all the conditioning. And once that presence is fully inhabited, once he's established himself in that ground, the opinions of others lose their power to move him. Not because he's become arrogant or indifferent, but because he's found something more solid than approval to stand on. He's found himself, and having found himself, he no longer needs to find himself reflected in others' eyes. He can finally rest, not in isolation from the world, but in a deep, abiding connection to the truth of his own being. He walks alone, yes, but he walks in peace. He walks in truth. He walks as himself, fully and completely, without apology or explanation. And in that solitary walk, he's more present, more engaged, more genuinely alive than he ever was in the crowds where he once sought belonging. The path of awakening is a lonely one, not because it separates us from others, but because it requires us to let go of the false connections we once mistook for real intimacy. And once those fall away, what remains is rare, precious, and worth every moment of the solitude it costs to find.